and thank you for being here tonight. So we really appreciate it. Annalee, Bennin, District Administrator. So I think that what's really important as we're going to talk about long-range facility planning tonight is to kind of talk about the journey of where the district has been. I think it's really important to know the history and our origin. This is a lot of words and a timeline on one slide, but I think what it's really been interesting for me, especially being in the district for a year and a half now, is to learn how did Franklin Public Schools start? And it started, like many districts in the state, there were thousands of one classroom districts that started out in Wisconsin. And then for us, it became Ben Franklin Elementary School, which was a K-8. So that was in 1951. And you'll see around 1957, we merged with Ben Franklin, so not the existing Ben Franklin down the road, the older version of Ben Franklin, which has since been razed or torn down, and also Willow Edge, which is a school that we never used within our school district. So in 1962 is kind of another important point in that timeline, is that's when we got the high school. So now went from a K-8 district to a K-12 district, right? And we have the high school that's built on the property where it is now on 51st. And it's been kind of neat to say whether you graduated from there or your children did, or they will, or you're just a community member that's moved in and haven't had children through the system. We've all been able to say, we're savers. We've all walked through those same doors. So the district continued to keep growing. You're going to kind of see this timeline where enrollment grows in the city. You see some growth in the schools, stagnates for a bit, grows again. So in the 60s, a lot of that growth happened with Pleasant View and Robinwood being our next schools that added on. In 1968, is when Robinwood came in. 1970 is when we built the first middle school. So Forest Park Middle School, which was across the road but up a little ways, right, has since been raised to build the building that you see outside as you drive in today. In the 90s was another bigger burst of growth in Franklin, so we saw a number of referendums pass in that time, and you see a lot of additions to a variety of our schools. So you hear about Countrydale quite often as a school that we've added onto. Remember, that was one of those one school classrooms, and it's built out over time. This building, the district office, used to actually be out of Countrydale. We grew into Southwood Glen then, being a new elementary in 1992, added on to those other elementaries. Then we raised Ben Franklin, and the new Ben Franklin was built in the late 90s. So it's always fun to call it the new Ben Franklin, but even that, it's 25 years old. And so I think conversations that have been fun to have within our team and in the district and with our consultants is how much education has changed, how much the world that we're getting our learners ready for to move out to has changed. It's no longer like what you're experiencing in this room, right? The sage on the stage, like I'm teaching or sitting and listening. That's not what our classrooms look like the majority of the day anymore. And it's not really what best prepares our learners for the future. So what we're also looking at when we're looking at the age of our facilities and a lot of the other information we'll share tonight is how are we also creating the best learning environment to get our learners ready for what it looks like in the future. So then we move into the 2000s. Referendum passed in 2012 to build the Saber Center. So that same existing high school, we've now built a great cornerstone on it of the Saber Center, and we were able to touch a variety of the classrooms, some of them in that time, but as Nick will tell you when we dive deeper into the high school, we only touched about 25% of the school at that time. So a lot of the original remaining high school from 1962 still is there, but you're also going to see some other additions when we jump a little further into the high school, but how we've continued to grow on that site. And then our most recent celebration, which we'll talk about a little more, was the ability to go to the community in 2016, talk about Forest Park Middle School and its needs, and get support from the community to build a new school, and at that time also move 6th grade back to middle school. So along this timeline, you'll see 6th grade's kind of in and out of elementary school. We move it back to the middle school, and we start 4K. So another great opportunity in our district, growing from just K-12 to now 4K-12 in the last 5 years. So a little bit of the origin and the history and knowing kind of how the district has grown and how some of the buildings have aged with us and some of those buildings have aged out and how we're getting to that next phase of discussion. So what is Franklin Forward? You've maybe heard this branded quite a bit, maybe in the last 6 or 7 months specifically. I would say monthly at board meetings, we've been presenting with the board to talk about multiple different avenues of how we've looked at our facilities, how we've looked at our compliance, what the future of learning looks like, and what kind of recommendations we have. Prior to that, I would say over a year, we've been looking at just studying our facilities. So Andy Daniels came on. Today's his 1-year anniversary. He just told me that. So he's our buildings and grounds director. But he started doing with C.D. Smith this walking through every building and reassessing the facilities. Because we've done that before, right? That's not a new thing for Franklin. Much like Mike said, we've looked at these things through time. However, the plans become old and have to get revisited and reviewed. And that's what we've had an opportunity to do through the Franklin Forward work. You'll see it through multiple avenues as we start talking through the slide deck. But there's 4 different ways we've looked at our district moving forward that will break down by schools or by level. What we wanted to start out with was a celebration. Because Forest Park Middle School is a celebration. It's a beautiful school, and it's beautiful because it's extremely functional. It's compliant in a lot of ways. It offers collaborative spaces and learning environments for our learners to be able to embrace what it is to work with their peers, what it is to go through complex problem solving, how they can embrace technology in different environments with their peers, but also learn from their educators, right? They're still getting that direct instruction, but then they're also breaking out into how does that work look moving forward, and how do they build on it from where they are. So Forest Park, like you saw, is across the road. When we built Forest Park, it was raising the old building. It offered us the opportunity to not interrupt any learning. That's something just to have in the back of our minds, is it's something we're always weighing out when we talk about tonight what are recommended plans. We're always trying to look at how does that affect the educators in our community, but what does that look like for a learner too? What are they experiencing from elementary school as they step into that middle school? And what are they experiencing as they step out of that middle school into our high school that we have? How are we having some continuity in that learning environment and what that space looks like? Nick's going to talk to us a little bit further about what that journey was for Forest Park through that time.
Thanks. So again, my name is Nick Kent. I'm an architect with PRA, and I had myself and my team had the great opportunity to work on Forest Park. And it's to the earlier comment about thinking big and celebrating what this community has accomplished. This is kind of a great story along those lines. When we started off looking at this project in 2015, we began very similar to how we started this process that we're engaged in right now. We started looking at the old Forest Park, and quite honestly, the thought process was, maybe we just need to spruce this up, and this building can continue on. And that's kind of the path that we started down. So for those of you who've been in the community for a while, some of these photos may be a little bit of a flashback to spaces now dearly departed. I do like to point out the space on the lower left. That was a particular fan favorite, playing volleyball in that gym, or basketball. The beam was in play. There were special house rules if you were playing at Forest Park. And a little piece of that beam still lives on up in the library at New Forest Park now as a bench, just being used for a different purpose than deflecting balls. But some of the things, there were maintenance issues, right? So that's not unusual for buildings or houses or any kind of structure. But in this building, we really looked at some of the oddities, right? So the center picture on the top, that's a kind of a typical classroom. And while we had the right square footage, it was so oddly configured, it was compromised. Its usability was being limited. So we went down a process and we started to look at, well, what would it take to renovate this building? And some of these images may, again, look familiar to those of you who are in the community. We included these on the community survey, and these were different options looking at, well, how far do we want to go with this structure? And everything from on the right to, well, we're going to add a gym because we needed more gym space even back then in 2015, 2016, to the image on the left was, what would it take to take this kind of odd-shaped building? You can see our hexagonal pod structure all woven together. What would it take to really transform that into a flexible, collaborative, responsive building? It was pretty daunting. So the survey asked the community, would you support a question that renovated this, or would you look at completely replacing the building with something new? And like I said, when we started on this process, we kind of thought the community's probably going to say, just renovate the old building. That's not what the community said. The community said, start new. And when we looked at this, these are the objectives, or some of the objectives that we were trying to achieve with this new facility. We're looking at proper core curriculum classrooms, right? How do we serve every student appropriately? What about collaborative spaces? What about all those spaces in between those collaboration rooms? How do we get kids out of learning in hallways and into learning in proper educational spaces, properly accommodating the special education needs. When that building was originally built, that just wasn't part of what was being accommodated in our buildings. So we want to make sure we're supporting our kids there. Staff, our student services, a commons, like an actual space where you want to be, that's encouraging, that's engaging, that's warm and welcoming, not just a big cafeteria. PE, we'll talk a lot about gym space. That was a challenge then, it's still a challenge today, and then site circulation and play areas. So that resulted in the building, and for those of you who may not have had an opportunity to be in that structure, this is something that you should all be very proud of. We've brought school districts from all over the state to tour this building. This is a very special building, and Franklin should really celebrate its existence. So here are a couple snapshots of what it looks like inside. So that upper left corner, that's what a corridor looks like today. It's not just a place to circulate and put boots and hats and lockers. It's actually a place to learn outside of the four walls of the classroom. The library on the lower left, it's open, collaborative, welcoming space. It's not a locked down box that's kind of a repository for books. It's an active learning environment. And then right here in the upper right, proper spaces to honor the needs of every single student in our building. So that's just one of the rooms for some OTPT in the special education suite. Some other rooms, classrooms, they look a little bit different. They're connected. We have greater flexibility. The furniture looks a little bit different. We've got a big gym. The biggest gym in the district is actually at the middle school. A little bit odd for a Division I school district to have the largest gym at the middle school, but that is what it is. It's a 3-station gym designed to be expanded to 4 in the future. And then on the upper right, a big piece of this was looking at hands-on learning, CTE curriculum. How are we going to expose students in the middle years to potential opportunities that may catch their interest as they move forward into the high school? And you're going to see that reflected in some of the work that we're looking at now. So this is an interesting touch point for us. So we are living through a period of inflation, right? That's eating at all of our balance sheets. So back in 2016, that referendum to build the building that sits right across the street, that was a $43.3 million project. So together with C.D. Smith, we took a look at what would that building cost today? If we were here today talking about the middle school, instead of other projects in the building, what would that be, or in the district, what would that be? That building today would be in the neighborhood of $80 million. Same exact building. And this is a challenge that we all face, right, with inflation. This is a challenge that we will face looking forward at our buildings. But to put that into some context, what do these dollar figures mean today? That's what Forest Park would cost today to recreate.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the elementary schools. So probably as you're aware, we have 5 elementary schools in Franklin. And it's a celebration to have that, but it creates these neighborhood schools, which we have identified as a guiding principle, as a piece that we've said we're going to hold strong to. And what that means is the school's relatively close to where you live. You get used to the families, but also that the sections are 3 classrooms. So like first grade has 3 sections. That's what it is. So not looking for elementaries that are large, like our middle or our high school, but also liking, like we said earlier, like it is really neat to say we're all sapers in the end. We all walk out of the same high school. But when we're really learning at those young ages and embracing and teaching what school's about, it's nice to have 5 schools. It also creates the challenge of what's the variance within our own district. How is it different across schools? And those are some of the pieces that we'll talk about and look at. We're going to look through 4 lenses when we look at our elementary schools and then again at our high school. So the first lens is through enrollment and capacity. Nick will talk about this a little further, but we started out on this journey of we know we're growing in Franklin, right? It's pretty obvious that there's new housing going in, things like that. There's land that's being bought up. So we worked with actually 2 different consulting firms that are specialized in looking at enrollment and what that looks like in city growth. The first one we felt through multiple renditions and iterations wasn't really diving into what it looks like in Franklin. In that, how long do people stay in houses in Franklin before they move on? Do we have more quote unquote empty nesters or people moving out of houses sooner, right? We have more people that stay in their homes here. Also look at average family size, look at where that growth is coming into place. In the end, we worked with MD Roffers. So Mark Roffers is actually a graduate of Franklin. He understands a lot about the community. And it's been a really great partnership because he's really drilled into where is this growth coming from? What does that look like? And how's that actually going to equate to learners and seats down the line for our district? We'll dive more into that, but just so you know a little background of where does the data and the numbers come from in that piece, that's where we dove in deep. First presenting that to our board, I think last August already or September. Maintenance needs, like I referenced earlier, Andy Daniels worked with CD Smith to put together a full long-range plan over the next 10 years of all 8 of our buildings. So our 7 schools and the building we're in right now, the ECC. Geography and location, we'll talk a bit about the land that the district purchased a few years ago. There's 220 acres. What that looks like when we think about recommended plans moving forward, and what locations we look at even when we talk about high school, right? Talked about some great things we've added at the high school. We're going to have recommended plans we talk through tonight, and we're going to talk about why that location was important in our discussion. And then educational suitability. So some of that talk that I had about what is the future of learning and educating look like, those are things that we want to look at in our schools. A lot of the things Nick just walked through at the middle school. So thinking about that collaborative space, but with elementaries, it also means how are we thinking about that across all 5 schools? You know, at what point do we start to have to look at areas that we need to touch in each of those schools to make sure that that educational suitability is there?
All right, so I want to touch on the first of those lenses, and that was the enrollment projections. And this is the summary of the data from Mark Roffers and his team. So again, when we kind of launch into this, we kind of have these assumptions that we think may be true, but we have to test them, we have to prove them. And we thought, well, Franklin's a growing community, right? We must be facing enrollment pressure across the board. Well, in fact, what Roffers' data actually proved out is that's not exactly true. When you see, these are our elementary schools up at the top, and you see the projected enrollment stretching out in increments all the way out to 2040, 2041 school year. And 4 of our 5 elementary schools are actually doing pretty good. They're within their target capacity. We have one outlier, and that is Countrydale Elementary. So it actually almost doubles in size. You say, well, why would that be? Why would Countrydale be so different from the other 4? Well, the way it's organized right now, the Countrydale attendance boundary, the vast majority of developable land within the city or the Franklin School District is in the Countrydale attendance area. So we know that there is growth, and right now it's concentrated within where Countrydale sits today. When we look at the middle school is okay out through the foreseeable future, and that's not an accident. We actually looked at that when we designed the size of the new Forest Park Middle School that sits there today. And Franklin High School is in yellow, which means that it's a little bit above the target capacity, but well under the maximum capacity. So when we look at capacities of buildings, there's kind of a range. And in a high school, you plan for a 20% range to accommodate for inefficiencies in scheduling as well as fluctuations in enrollment. So our high school is actually, as currently configured, okay. So it is not a pressure point for us. The second piece that we looked at, as mentioned earlier, is the facilities conditions assessment. So this is the piece that Andy Daniels and CD Smith dove deep, and they looked at just about every nut and bolt in the school district and developed a very robust report. So if nothing changed in the school district, what would those things be that would have to be planned for and addressed? And those were some of the categories that were reviewed: the exterior envelope, how do we keep our kids warm, safe, and dry; roofs; accessibility, how do we make our buildings meet the needs of all of our students; life safety systems, staying up to current codes; finishes is more wear and tear, right? You know, carpet, paint, ceiling tiles, those things wear over time, just like at home. And then the systems that drive those buildings: plumbing, electrical, and HVAC. HVAC is heating, ventilating, and air conditioning, just to avoid the jargon. The pool at the high school is a whole special case, keeping the pool up and operational and keeping tiles firmly affixed to the walls is a constant challenge that Mr. Daniels has, and then looking at our sites. So the way this shook out, again, these are maintenance dollars, just maintenance, not improving the buildings, not changing things in the buildings, just maintaining the buildings. So the 10-year maintenance needs across our 5 elementary schools. You can see Ben Franklin, about 10.5, just over 10.5 million. Southwood Glen, a little over $11 million in maintenance. Robinwood is kind of the big one, $18.4 million. Pleasant View, 10.4, and Countrydale, just under $12 million over the next 10 years in maintenance needs at these schools. Just of note, those are 24, 25 numbers, right? So of course, if we extrapolate that out 10 years and start work 10 years later, inflation will change those numbers. So those are forecasted as 24, 25. The next piece is looking at, okay, so now we've understood the nuts and bolts and keeping our buildings up and running, but how do they work as tools for the purpose that they were created for in the first place, right? These are tools in the hands of the educators, the students, and the community to educate our students. So we looked at, just like we did at the middle school, we looked at things like, do we have 4K, 5K, core curriculum classrooms? Are we meeting the needs across the district? How does that look? Collaborative spaces, how do they compare back to the high school? I'm sorry, the middle school. Are we meeting the needs of small group and intervention? The myriad of things that happen within our elementary schools today that probably didn't happen when those buildings were built, in some cases, all the way back in the 1950s. Things have changed significantly. Special education, just like at the middle school, finding those proper spaces, creating proper support for all of our students, and then acknowledging community function. There are a lot of things that happen within all of the buildings in the district that are outside of the things that happen within our normal school day. We want to accommodate community functions. And outdoor spaces, I'm sure lots of you have sat in pickup lines or drop-off lines at all of the elementary schools that may or may not work super well ever. So how can we improve those things? Some photos, you'll probably find some familiar spaces in there, whether they are classrooms that are small, furniture that maybe is not flexible or very adaptable, gymnasiums that are functioning as cafeterias as well. We're trying to flip multiple functions simultaneously. Libraries that may not really, again, be very adaptable or necessarily responsive to all of the things that are happening within those spaces. Okay, so we wanted to try to quantify, what does this really mean? So we can walk through buildings and kind of anecdotally say, well, this looks tight or this looks small, but what does that really mean? How do we compare one building to another? So we created what we called the model elementary school. We said if we were going to create a brand new elementary school, what would that tool look like? What would that school look like in Franklin Public Schools? And we use that as a benchmark to compare all 5 of the existing elementary schools to it. So we charted these things and we said how much of that space is adequate or is better than adequate. So it's meeting our model. And we said, well, that's going to be our green space, all the way to stuff that is maybe too small, not properly sized, or just plain doesn't exist. So the stuff that doesn't exist is the red on the bottom, but we'll start with the green on the top. So last time, the names were taken off all these bars, and that threw me for a loop. They put mascots instead. So this time, I know, we have Southwood Glen on the left. Southwood Glen's in pretty good shape. The majority of our space is meeting what our model school looked like. Ben Franklin is also in pretty good shape. Again, the majority is there. Pleasant View is about 50-50, but it's still a pretty solid building. And then we get out to Robinwood and Countrydale, where the majority of our space is falling short of where we want our educational suitability. Just flipping the bars around, there you go. So this is highlighting what is not meeting our model school or just doesn't exist. So this kind of led us to focus in on the last 2 of our buildings, Countrydale and Robinwood. So over at Countrydale, again, we had just under $12 million in deferred maintenance, and a significant amount of our space really would need to be renovated or expanded or built new to come up to the same standard that we're trying to get all of our schools to. Here's what Robinwood looks like. It's a little bit higher on the maintenance need, but a little bit lower on the educational suitability. But still, the majority of the spaces at Robinwood are not up to where our model wants to be. So, what we looked at, Countrydale, it may be time to move on. So similar to the exploration and conversation that we had at the middle school, to renovate and modernize existing Countrydale on a very small site may not be the wise path forward. So the proposal now is to look at replacing Countrydale on the new piece of land. To build a new Countrydale and remove the old Countrydale on its existing site is about a $41.7 million project. So the new building would be built to the model school standard to meet all of those things that were identified as the needs to serve our students for the next generations. A little bit about district boundaries and properties. So this might help to illustrate a little bit of where we have a geography question. So you can see in the upper left-hand corner, that's where existing Countrydale is. It's kind of in the far corner of where the district boundaries are. The proposal now is to move it down to the south. And you may or may not know, the district does own a piece of land, about 220 acres, on Ryan Road, bounded on the west by 92nd Street, on the east by 80th Street. That is within the current Countrydale attendance boundaries. So the idea would be to relocate Countrydale to that new site. And if we think about where the land is in the city that is still developable, it is primarily down along the southern part of the district. So this is actually shifting capacity down to where the future pressure will be.
This is a good opportunity to pause and get feedback from you or recommendations, thoughts from what you heard about elementary schools and where that led the team to look at, this is what we'd recommend at this time, knowing that there's needs in Robinwood and Countrydale, leaning towards a Countrydale raise and replace at this time on the 220 acres. So high school is exciting. I could say it again, it is neat, I think, to have one high school. Like, we all are competing for the same academic pieces, the same athletic activities, co-curriculars, right? We're all Sabres. We all walk in and out of those doors each day and graduate as a Sabre. What we've looked at in the view of Franklin High School are the same 4 lenses we saw from elementary school. What I can say a little different about each of those, Nick already hit a little on the enrollment capacity. We're in that yellow zone, which means we're in like a safe area. We're not worried about bursting at the seams at the high school, but we also know in some of the recommended plans, we're gonna make better use of some space and gain some usable footage in that school anyways. Maintenance needs is pretty straightforward. Over 10 years, we'll go through what that looks like for the high school. Geography and location, just like we grappled with Countrydale or Robinwood, what do we recommend? We did the same with the high school. So we first grappled with, okay, if we're looking at 25% of the high school was touched when we did the referendum about a little over a decade ago, there's a lot that's not touched, or maybe some renovations along the way. We talked about what would it look like to build on the 220 acres. Would we move the whole school? We removed that thought because we do have a beautiful PAC there, right? We have a great football field that's turfed on the other side that we use for lacrosse and our other athletics. So it was determined, same site, we could do it on the same site, we can reach the pieces we want. So the geography, location, conversation shifts a little bit for high school. And then educational suitability is a huge part of the high school conversation. So we've heard a little bit already about gyms, reference a 2-station. It's actually a 1+, it's not even a 2-station is what I've learned in this process. So that's not a typical Division I, right? That's about the size of a typical Division IV school. So we'll talk about a lot with educational suitability when we look at career and technical education, we look at our special needs spaces, and we look at even our science labs and being ADA compliant.
So let's just take a quick look at how the building we know got there. It's a very colorful diagram. So this building has continuously been growing over time, right? Starting way back in 1961, that was the original piece, kind of in the middle now of what we know as today's high school. And was added on to in 63, 68, 70, 74, 95, 99, and last in 2013. So that kind of growth doesn't necessarily lead to super efficient use of space or necessarily the best organization of space. And when we think about the 2013, which was an amazing project, right? And so the Sabre Center is beautiful. And when you approach the school today, especially if you're new to the community, that's what you see, right? It looks great. It looks like a beautiful building. You think, boy, they took care of everything in 2013. But the diagrams now up above, those are our floor plans. So the darker purple, that was what was added. The lighter purple is what was actually touched. And you can see the lower level, nothing was touched. So as Annalee mentioned earlier, only about a quarter of this existing building was actually affected in any way through the 2013. So what was done was wonderful. But there's still a lot more to do over at this building. And we think the front kind of maybe paints a rosier picture than what is actually happening behind that nice front facade. So when we dug in, just like at the elementary schools, what are our maintenance needs here at the building? This is the biggest number, kind of logical. It's by far the biggest building in the school district. So over the next 10 years, we're looking at about just over $32 million in maintenance. Again, just to keep the building as we know it today. It's not changing how it functions. So taking a look at that educational suitability, and lots, it's not at all unique to Franklin. This has happened really everywhere. What happens in the walls of Franklin High School today is very different from what happened in 1961 when this high school started. Career and technical education is seeing a resurgence, not just here in Franklin, but around our state. These are some existing photos of what it looks like today. There's tremendous interest. It's amazing when you're in the high school and walk through and seeing the students at work. They're actually turning away students because there's not physically enough space to support the demand for trades-based education. So you can see, like in these upper right photos, these are kids building essentially like little tiny houses. They are shoulder to shoulder, driving nails and using saws and things that, like on a C.D. Smith construction site would be like, you shouldn't. This is no good. But there's so much demand. Like they're trying to get as many kids in there as they possibly can. Autos. It's amazing. They've got cars all over the place, and they're working on autos. I mean, my car is sitting in my driveway right now because I have to wait 2.5 weeks to get somebody to look at a spark plug or something in my, I don't know anything about. Culinary arts, down in the lower right. That's basically a glorified residential kitchen. That is not at all what the culinary arts looks like today, and getting kids educated and interested in these fields. So these are just some photos of area high schools. So we heard it earlier. These are in Wisconsin. These are neighbors in our region. So what a metal shop looks like in the upper right with daylight, windows actually coming in. It's a modern space. Big autos labs with proper clearances around so you can work. Right when we go to a car dealer now, you look at the shop. It's very bright, clean, well-lit space. It's not that old, greasy metal shop that it used to be. Spaces right in the lower right, integrated into CT and career-based education that reflect professional workspaces, right? It's not always out getting dirty. There are times when you sit down and you collaborate and you think about problem solving and engineering and integration of these other trades into our learning. There are things like nursing. So nursing is a course that's offered right now at Franklin High School, but there is no space at the high school. They go to New Berlin.
New Berlin.
Yeah, so they actually have to leave the community to get access to this type of learning. Upper right, that's what culinary arts spaces now look like in high schools, right? Like they're showing kids what it looks like to work in this field. Not all of them are going to become chefs, but it's a very, very popular and growing area of study. PE. We keep talking about gym space, and there is a district-wide shortage of just stations to accommodate all of the activities that happen during the day for curricular needs, and after the day, and on weekends for clubs, for teams. The pool on the lower left, if you've been there, that's we've already touched on that. That's challenging. It's only 6 lanes. It does not meet the proper depth requirements for competition today. We have students working Zumba. There you go. In a non-Zumba room. They're just finding spaces within the building. And again, just for those of you who are in the circuit going to other high schools around our state to see what some of these spaces look like. All of these photos on the screen are high schools smaller than Franklin. So, whether it's a field house upper right, again with daylight, imagine daylight actually coming into a community space. Tennis has never been on campus. They've had to go off-site somewhere to play tennis. Swimming, you have state championship level swimming here in Franklin, but your pool is not really a competitive pool. Other spaces, weightlifting spaces. We took a tour a couple weeks ago and we're in the weightlifting room, and it's not a very welcoming space. It's not a space that all students may feel comfortable in or welcomed in, and it's very, very tight. So there are actually safety issues when you're in these weightlifting spaces. So what do we do about it? So we're looking at a multi-phase approach to modernizing and kind of completing the work at the high school. And our strategy right now is we would build from north to south. So north on this plan is left. So just kind of orient yourself. And on the left side of that graphic is the current football field, running track. So the first strategy would be in phase 1 to invest primarily in addressing athletics, CTE spaces, and CTE spaces. This is a $123.1 million project, a major investment in the high school. And what that really consists of is on the far left, starting with our athletic spaces that front onto our fields that are on our site, moving in towards the existing building with a core of very flexible, accommodating CTE spaces to meet our kids' needs, adding tennis courts on the north side as well as additional parking at the high school to better provide access on that. It's actually the east side of the school, and renovating some select spaces within the existing building. So that is our proposed first phase of work. Moving forward, phase 2. Potential spaces affected here at phase 2 as we make our way into the existing building would be adding additional fabrication labs, an ag lab with a greenhouse added into this space, core classrooms, business and technology. So we're starting to get back into the building and renovate some of those other classrooms that have not been touched, in some cases since they were built in 1961. Expanding makerspace classrooms and relocating student services within the building. The second phase of work is a roughly $24 million project. And then finally, the last phase of work to finish our modernization of this building. And this phase really needs to happen after the first 2 phases are complete because we're relocating functions from existing building into new building, which then frees up access to some of these other spaces. My last space is addressing the cafeteria, thinking about creating a more welcoming student commons space, finishing the core classroom renovation and modernization, building a robotics and ideation lab within the building, rethinking what the library is and relocating the library to another part of the building, creating a graphic arts space and a black box theater to finish the performing arts wing of the building. That is a $15.75 million third phase. And that is our high school.
So a lot of learning around the high school in different phases. I know Nick said this, but it's really important to know that phase 1 is really like a piece 1, right? You can't pick out phase 2 or phase 3 and choose to do them first. So phase 1 is very intentional in that moving from north to south in the building and how all the pieces move along the way. But any feedback, thoughts, questions, wonderings about high school? We're going to jump through to the next part because I think you might have more questions, but this pulls a little bit of kind of what's the recommended plan and the projects that are coming together right now for our district-wide planning. So Andy's going to talk to us a little bit about the impact. And remember, the $185 million, just before Andy starts, is looking at $20 million for district-wide maintenance. So that's across. So we saw that $96 million district-wide. This is saying we're going to take $20 million, that chunk. That'll touch all the schools except Forest Park for the most part. And this building it won't touch. The elementary school to raise or bring down and build new. Countrydale at 41.7, and then the high school phase 1 is 123 million. So that $185 million project is looking at phase 1 is looking at those pieces together. When Andy starts talking about the next impact of phase 1 and 2, that's adding the additional phase 2 from the high school. So that $24 million section that we saw. So the high school was like three projects. This is bringing in 1 and 2 in the second part. Sorry, Andy, go ahead.
Yeah, that's okay. So I get to talk about our second biggest financial asset, with our staff being our first one. But for this particular possibility in building, we took a look at, in working with our financial advisor, took a look at the $185 million, which Annalee laid out the projects, and that would add approximately $1.40 to our current mill rate. So this light blue bar here represents phase 1 alone, that $185 million. That's a 20-year bond, which is very typical in the education world. It's the max we can take out. They estimate approximately 5% from an interest rate, thinking we would take this out. If we were to end up going to referendum, it would be approved approximately next summer, somewhere in that time frame, spring to summer. And then using a pretty low property growth. So Franklin's boomed over the last 6 to 7 to 8 years at probably about 40%, I think is what I put in the annual meeting. But we're using 7% for this coming year, 2024, 5%, and then 2%. So keeping it pretty low. So we think we're probably going to beat that, but kind of that idea of we're going to not overpromise and underdeliver. We want to flip that around. Underpromise, and we're going to overdeliver on that. If we add phase 2 in, and it's really crucial to understand phase 2 is not standalone. Like phase 1 has to be done for phase 2 to come in. That would add approximately another 35 cents and be this last bar on the right-hand side. But if we take a look at both of those, that still puts us lower than where we were in 2020, with adding all of those particular projects in. So the mill rate's like a good look, but what does it really mean to you? So if we take a look at this particular chart, we're going to clip off property values at a rate of 100,000. And we always start with 100 because that's nice, easy math, right? That starts with a 1, pretty easy. But you'll see we'll go 200, 300, 400, 500, and most people don't fall exactly on that number, so you're going to slat somewhere in between. But just using $100,000 for ease of math, phase 1, approximately $11.67 per month, or $140, and you can see that's just cascading for each 100,000 all the way down. If we phase 2 alone, again on that $100,000 worth of property value is $292 or $35, and then phase 1 and 2 combined, if the survey were to come back favorably and the board says yes, we should pursue that, and ultimately we pass that, about $14.59 for every $100,000 of value per month, or $175 in total for both particular phases. So again, property values down below. If someone has a property value that doesn't fit on here, I'm happy to help you solve that particular problem too, and figure out where you would slot in on that. But the graph itself, trying to provide as many data points as possible for people to get an idea, like, what does it really mean to me? Because it all sounds great, right? It's a big list of things that we need, and it all sounds great, but ultimately it's going to come down to people taking a look at the educational component compared to what does it matter to me, and then making that decision for them personally.